Hello there. Today we are going to talk about pre-contact forestry. This video was voted for about 8 months ago on Patreon, and I never did anything with it because I couldn't find anything substantial to base the essay around. My usual historical informants were of little to no use. The accounts generally read something like this: we passed through a forest of mostly pine, followed by a forest of mostly oak. What the heck am I supposed to do with sources like that? Besides which, I couldn't find any relevant public domain images to use, so the video is just going to be me talking. Since dropping the project, I've given it months of thought, and I'm coming back now to sort of ramble my way around it. Maybe some of this will be interesting. So first off, let's go through our sources. History is not very useful here. The only thing I was able to find was a single sentence from Lafitau where he's talking about how steel axes allow people to cut down much bigger trees than they could with stone axes. This is really interesting to me because it seems to imply that the really big hardwoods would have just been left there. They're not worth the trouble of clearing them out. Something that sometimes happens when you're cutting a notch into a tree to fell it is that as the notch gets deeper, it gets harder and harder to land those axe blows exactly where you want. You get more likely to glance your axe off of the top or the bottom edge of the cut. This is quite hard on the hands. I've occasionally got some bruised veins in my palms from doing that. With a stone axe, this might be a big danger to the axe itself. A stone axe is only really strong in the one dimension. Sideways force, like in this kind of glancing blow, might just snap the axe in half. So maybe you'd burn the tree down, not really use your axe for very much. Well, that's still a lot of work. It's going to use a lot of fuel, but say you get it down, what then? You got this big 4-foot trunk. How do you process that? Well, you could carve the whole thing into a single dugout canoe, but you can't do much with it besides. Without a saw, you can't really cut something that big into firewood. Then we sort of get into the issue of the time commitment of the whole thing. I've felled some medium-large ash trees by hand with an axe. It takes a really long time and it's a lot of work. This was just sort of a medium-large tree, not a properly large tree. Stone axes are between 1/3 and 1/4 as efficient as a steel axe, depending on the quality. With stone axes, just getting a properly big hardwood on the ground would be several days of work, let alone processing it into something useful. So I think that this sentence from Lafitau is pretty reasonable. Steel axes and saws would make felling big trees a lot more feasible. So what do we know so far? Well, we know that whatever the practice was, it changed with contact. Great, we don't know what something is, but we know it's different than that. Very useful. If we read between the lines, we can say that most really big hardwoods would probably have just been left there. This actually makes sense from another practical side of things. Most really big hardwoods are kind of useful alive. You imagine a big old sugar maple, they're more productive in terms of sap than little sugar maples. You imagine a big old oak tree, they produce more acorns than little oak trees. The big old trees, they're harder to take down, sure, but they're also more useful to you alive than the little trees are. And that's as far as the historical research got me. So next we look at our archaeological sources. The archaeological sources here are very interesting, and they could be very useful, except they're conflicting. There were a series of papers I read which talked about charcoal residue in the sediment of a lake in Ontario. This lake was located close to a neutral village. The first paper I read was of the opinion that the Iroquoians were clearly burning the underbrush in the forests in order to keep them clear for deer. Regular, semi-controlled forest fires to keep the dead brush out of the way. This theory's strength, besides matching the evidence it's looking at, is that it goes along with the better established idea of people clearing out the underbrush to make the forests easier to traverse. The weakness is that if you're burning up all the underbrush in the forest, what are you to use for firewood? If felling trees with a stone axe is a lot of work and you can't really cut things into stove lengths, what are you to do for firewood besides deadfall? Well, you could fell mature trees and then wait for all the branches on top to die. Well, that seems a little bit wasteful when you could just collect the branches that they're dropping naturally to clear out the forest. Dragging the branches back to the village is going to be the same amount of work either way, but in one method you have to spend days felling trees, in the other you don't. The other weakness with this archaeological theory is that there are other interpretations of the same evidence. The second interpretation states that when people were clearing land for a village, they would take all the posts, use them to build the village, they'd take all the large branches, use them for firewood, and then all the little twigs that were too small to burn, they'd pile them over the stumps and set them on fire. Get rid of the stumps, get rid of the debris, enrich the soil all in one fell swoop. This theory doesn't really tell us anything about forestry management, and unfortunately it's better than the first one. It matches the evidence a lot better and it doesn't present any inconvenient questions. It fits in fairly nicely with what is known to be known. It's a fairly good theory, just not useful to me in examining this subject. There's a third theory which states that actually that charcoal residue in the pond, that's from burning strawberry fields. It's well established that strawberry fields were regularly burned in order to keep down the weeds, and that's what you're identifying here in this residue. This theory doesn't match the archaeological evidence as well as the second one, but I quite like it because of its nihilism. Why did this group of Neanderthals seem to collect weird-looking rocks? Was it some religious practice? Did it have some cultural significance? No, it's probably just that one of these Neanderthals thought they looked cool. We always want these discoveries to tell us something exciting and interesting, but it's equally important to consider those explanations which tell us nothing. Future archaeologists digging through your house, oh, why does this guy have so many swords? Well, clearly 21st century Canadians lived in violent times. No, actually, it's just because I think they look cool. As far as I know, that's the end of the archaeological angle. Next, we've got the oral history angle. From what I'm aware, there isn't anything which talks about forestry practice. Here's what I've got. When people would leave a village, they would replant the fields with cedar trees so that they would have enough cedars to rebuild the village and the palisade when they came back. This makes sense from a variety of angles. Cedar trees are fairly easy to plant. You just cut some branches, shake them out over the prepared soil. Your retired garden beds would be ideal for this. It makes sense from other angles. The fields would often encompass several hundred acres, more with the village. It takes time for trees to recolonize an area. You want to be able to return to this spot in 40 to 60 years. Returning to sites, you can make sure you've always got the best site. Good defensible location, close to water, right kind of forest nearby. You can build up earthworks over generations. You can tailor the forests to have more useful trees. It makes a lot of sense to come back to the same spot. If you were to just leave this 200-acre field to natural regeneration without any human intervention, the trees that would grow there would not be the sort that you would want to rebuild your village. This is something we often see in rewilding heavily disrupted areas. You get certain aggressive colonists that take over the field. What you want this field to turn into is a cedar forest. Cedars are soft, therefore easy to fell, they're light, and therefore easy to transport and build with, and they last a long time in the ground, which means that your houses will last a long time. You need a lot of cedar trees for posts and beams and your palisade. If you just leave your field to natural regeneration, what a lot of the trees are going to be is poplar. Poplars are very good colonists. They got little light seeds that blow a long way, and the trees can spread by cloning. They're also some of the fastest growing trees in the region. Unfortunately, they're not very useful trees. The wood rots very quickly. Not good for building with. It's soft and brittle, therefore not very good for tools, and it's light, doesn't burn very well. Nature wants to reclaim this 200-acre field into a poplar grove. You don't want it to do that. This sort of logical reasoning is how we know that the oral history is more or less correct here. Returning to the same location generation after generation is a lot less feasible if you're not replanting. You need those cedar trees, and planting them is not very difficult. Now, while this tells us something about the relationship to the field and these human-planted cedar groves, it doesn't tell us anything about how people related to the wider forest. And I haven't heard anything, wasn't able to find anything that gave any better clues. So what about modern practice? Any clues there? Well, unfortunately modern practice is largely derived from late 1800s logger barons. Back in the day, not a lot of jobs for native people besides manual labor. There was a lot of logging going on. People get a job clear-cutting somebody else's land, and then they come back home and think that that's normal practice, pass that on. The modern practice is pretty much the same tradition as the Canadian public at large. The only real difference is that with Six Nations, if a farm isn't working, your soil isn't giving you anything, you don't push it, you just give it up, and it'll be a home for deer at least. Which is again more or less the same policy as Canadian farmers, just a little bit more persnickety about what qualifies as marginal land. So no real clues on that front. So what other angles do we have to approach this from? Well, what about neighboring cultures that might give us some clues? In looking into this, I was actually able to discover the Ojibwe philosophy for forestry management. This video would be a lot easier if I were an Ojibwe. Their traditional philosophy is very simple and charismatic. You take only what the forest gives you. As in, anything dead, that's yours. Don't cut the live stuff unless you got a good reason. Now, on the face of it, this sounds like typical hippy-dippy, crunchy granola, woo-woo flake stuff. When you think about it though, the simplicity and romanticism of it actually hide a lot of practical value. You strip away the romantic notion of it, this is a really good policy. Let's say for instance that you want to make a bow. If you go and you cut a live tree, that ash is going to have to cure for a good year and a half before you can make a bow out of it. You cut a freshly dead tree, it's only going to have to cure for a month or two. It's already been curing out in the woods. You can get a bow faster if you cut dead wood than live wood. The same thing holds true for building materials. You cut a beam, you have to wait until it's finished shrinking before you can build with it. If it's dead, it's going to finish shrinking a lot quicker. Same thing for firewood. You cut a fresh oak tree, oak takes a long time to dry. It's going to take you 2 years before that wood is ready to burn. Or if it's already dead, you can burn it in a couple of weeks. It's a very practical policy from the material side of things. It's also good from the environmental side of things. If you're only taking what the forest gives you, you're not taking more than what the forest can spare. Modern global warming side of things. One of the useful things trees do is they suck up carbon and use it to build their bodies. Carbon sequestering. Now, when you burn a tree, all of that carbon is released back into the atmosphere. But this also happens when a tree rots. Burning naturally dead wood has very little atmospheric impact. It's almost the same effect as if the wood was left to rot on the forest floor, it just happens faster. The atmospheric impact of burning wood isn't so much in the burning of the wood itself as it is in the cutting of the live tree. Modern day, if you're only burning dead wood, it's kind of guilt-free. This policy is just really good from just about every angle. The only shortcoming of it is that it's low yield relative to area. You got, let's say, a 1 acre woodlot, you might only lose 2 or 3 trees a year. You need a decent little bit of forest for this sort of policy to work. It also requires a bit of attention. You gotta go for regular walks to look for dead trees, which I would actually call a strength, give you an excuse to go for a nice walk, get some fresh air and exercise. Being out and about just to get a change of scenery is one thing, but being out and about with a purpose is another. So that's the Ojibwe policy. Now, could Iroquoian people have used something similar? Well, it's possible, but I don't think it's likely. The circumstances are different between the two cultures. The Ojibwe mode, they had small villages, they moved around a couple times a year, and they didn't do much agriculture. Iroquoians, large villages, move around a couple times a century and do rather a lot of agriculture. This changes things. If you're going to be staying in the same place for the next 20 years, then setting up a lot of oak firewood to dry over the course of 2 years is not such a daunting prospect anymore. Curing a bow staff for a year before you carve it, that's a lot more feasible if you're staying in the same place for a year. Then we got other issues. The clearing of land for fields and agriculture, that does not conform nicely to this philosophy. Or even building the village, a dozen wigwams, that takes a heck of a lot less wood than a dozen longhouses. It gets even worse when you add a palisade into the equation. That's a heck of a lot of trees. So, I've kind of been through all of the evidence and I don't have any sort of conclusion to this. When I originally envisioned this project, I was hoping for something more concrete that I could present. As it is, all I've got is speculation, but let's go ahead with the speculation anyway. I think that there probably was a standard practice, but I don't think there was a philosophy. Lafitau says that the steel tools have changed the practice, and I don't think the practice would have changed that much if there was a unifying philosophy. I think that people probably didn't often fell living trees for firewood. I don't think it would have been worth the effort with stone tools. I think people mostly burned dead branches or trees uprooted in windstorms. This would have the double function of helping to keep the forest floor clear to aid with travel, hunting, and gathering. I think that when living trees were felled for firewood, you'd prioritize the ones that aren't very useful alive. You want lots of sugar maples, you want lots of nut trees. Easiest way to ensure you got lots of those in the future, just don't cut them down. I think that really big hardwoods were probably just infeasible to work with and would probably be just left there even if they were in the middle of a field. You'd only bother with a really big oak tree if you needed to make a war canoe or something like that. And I'm pretty sure that people replanted their fields with cedar trees after they left. You need a lot of cedar trees to rebuild a village, and the only place cedar trees tend to naturally dominate is in swamps. You don't want to build your village near a swamp, you don't want to farm in a swamp. The whole village cycle system, it seems kind of dumb if you're not replanting. It doesn't seem like it would work very well. Whereas it seems like it would work quite well if you are replanting. That's kind of as much as I've got. I don't really have enough evidence to come up with any kind of concrete theory. Rather frustrating. I hope you found this interesting nonetheless. If you got any other evidence that I'm unaware of, I'd be glad to see it. Thank you. As this topic was requested on Patreon, I'd like to take a moment to thank those people who are donating $1 a month or more. I don't often go out of my way to offer this kind of thanks. It's kind of not compatible with short videos, but I'd like to take the opportunity now that I'm here. I want to thank you for your continued support and ongoing patience. Your contribution makes a big difference to my quality of life. Thanks to all of you. Apologies in advance. I'm going to do my best to say them correctly, but I'm inevitably going to get some of them wrong, so that is what it is. Ancient Americas, Steve Jenkins, Matthew Lindeman, Aiden, Booch Gnarly and the Bathtub Boys, Dennis Creek, Bumlins, Daniel, Cinnabar, Mello, Manny Arias, Susie Cernaker, Winchester 94, Alan Brambleshire, Jace O'King, Nathaniel Annunziata, Chrono, Sam Pullman, Aidan Linder, Andreas Sturbeck, Sam Ham, Astor, Alex Rawlinson, Rachel Ann, Rowan DeWitt, Cole Robert Berry, Evelyn Lemoy, Liam Fitzpatrick, Lucas Lyons, Mailman, Tom Rogers, Lohick, Coulter Vachon, Kieran Buchanan, Michael, Vian Zhu, William Colley, Eric Grazulis, Nat Chapman, Rocinante, Ian Pogue, Chris Matthews Jr., Dan Hellman, Gab Fortin, Rowan Dill, Charles Rosenbauer, Ugg Oogleby, Tom, MHD, Craig Simstrider, Cyrus Bird, Joseph Reed Gaines, Matthew Barad, Wynn, Jake Outrage, Luca Kemp, Louis McQuarrie, Hirsuta, Jeff Lagenauer, Clayton Reeves, Milos Lepak, Max Bromberg, Brian Wakowitz, Christian Pickup, Tyler Mock, Alina Boyden, Brandon Estevez, Eric Pine, Mitchum Tuel, Danzy, Hazmat, Aaron Stewart, Kehaya, John Broyles, Sam, Gabe, Will M., Carmsay, Framby Guelpus, Andrew Korb, Patrick Behrens, Carlo, Anton Giula, Everett Phillips, Colin Cravella, Doazulu, Drew Austin, Andreas, Why Do I Need a Name for Patreon, Blackle Maury, Spencer Secord, A. Lid, Electron Kaleidoscope, Adrian, Michael Dylan Rogers, Dimnot, Ben Hong, Dylan. Thanks to all of you. I don't often show it, but I do appreciate your support. And thanks to any of you who've stuck around through those credits.